Have you ever made a promise you couldn't keep, one that haunted you long after the world forgot? Because sometimes the road doesn't forgive. It remembers every vow, every face you left behind. It's a quiet night in a small American town, the kind where the streetlights flicker like tired memories. Then, out of nowhere, comes the low growl of an engine. One, then another. Headlights slice through the dark, one by one, until the silence turns into a roar. And somewhere in that sound, between the echoes of thunder and regret, lies the story of a man who once broke a promise to a boy who needed him most. Jack Turner, once a biker with fire in his eyes and blood on his hands. A man who rode fast enough to escape everything, except his own guilt. Years ago, he found a scared orphan hiding behind a church door, a kid named Eli. The boy had no one, no family, no home. Just those eyes that asked for something Jack didn't think he had left to give. Hope. And for one brief moment, Jack became more than a biker. He became a promise. "I got you, kid," he said. "You'll never be alone again." But life has a way of testing even the strongest hearts. One bad decision, one night of chaos, and Jack vanished down a road that led him straight into darkness. The kind of darkness where men forget who they were and who they were supposed to protect. Years passed. The boy grew up, but not the way he should have. The world chewed him up and spat him out. People like him, orphans, wanderers, the forgotten, don't stand much of a chance in towns built on cruelty and silence. And Jack, he tried to convince himself that promises die when the engines stop. But deep down, he knew some promises don't stay buried. They follow you, whispering through the hum of every passing bike, in every empty motel room, in every face that reminds you of the one you left behind. Have you ever felt that kind of weight? That one thing you wish you could go back and fix, if only life gave second rides? Stay with me until the end, because what's about to happen may surprise you. Tonight, Jack Turner's past is about to catch up with him. The same town that once watched him disappear will soon hear the sound of redemption on two wheels. But this time, he won't ride alone. Some stories aren't just about justice. They're about the moment a man decides to stop running from his own heart. And when the first headlight cuts through the mist, you'll understand why this story isn't just about a biker or a promise. It's about loyalty, forgiveness, and the roar of engines that refuse to forget. What you're about to discover now may shake something inside you, because in this world, even the toughest men have ghosts that ride with them. And sometimes the only way to silence those ghosts is to keep the promise you once broke. The night is just beginning, the engines are waking, and somewhere beyond the highway's edge, a broken vow is about to become a battle cry. Stay close, because the roar you're hearing isn't just noise, it's redemption on the way back home. Because sometimes it's not the road that changes us, it's the people we meet along the way. And when you see a man like Jack Turner standing at the edge of his past, looking at the road he once abandoned, it makes you wonder, how many of us have done the same? How many promises have we broken, thinking we'd never get the chance to make things right again? If something in this story has stirred something inside you, tell me about it. Maybe you've been that person who walked away, or maybe you're the one still waiting for someone to come back. Your words matter here. They're not just comments. They're voices that keep this space alive. So write down what this story made you feel. I read them all, and everyone helps shape what we build next together. And if you want more stories like this, real, raw, human stories about justice, loyalty, and second chances, take a second to hit the like button. It might seem small, but it's what keeps these stories riding further, reaching people who need to hear that redemption still exists. You can also subscribe if you haven't yet. This channel isn't just about storytelling. It's a kind of brotherhood, a place where every story reminds us that even in the darkest moments, there's light waiting somewhere down the road. When you subscribe, you're not just following content, you're joining that ride. Because when you engage, when you comment, like, and stay, you help keep this engine Running. You make sure stories like Jack's don't fade into silence. Now, keep your eyes on that horizon. The engines are growing louder. Something's coming, and it's going to change everything. The rain fell in sheets that night, the kind that makes the world feel smaller, colder, almost erased. The old church stood like a forgotten memory at the edge of town, its cross barely visible through the storm. Lightning split the sky, and for a second the world flashed white, revealing a boy, no more. The Nate curled beneath the church steps. His name was Eli. Mud clung to his knees, his fingers trembled against the soaked fabric of his shirt, and the look in his eyes carried that quiet kind of terror that only children who've seen too much can wear. He didn't cry, not anymore. He had run out of tears days ago, maybe weeks. Hunger had a way of drying them up, replacing them with something heavier, resignation. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces that left him behind, the house that once smelled of bread and soap, now felt like a dream he couldn't return to. All that remained was the storm, and the sound of thunder rolling over the empty streets. That's when he heard it, the low, steady growl of an engine cutting through the rain. It wasn't the sound of a car or a truck. It was deeper, raw, alive, a motorcycle. The headlights sliced through the curtain of water, growing brighter until it stopped a few feet away. The engine idled like a beast catching its breath. The rider dismounted, black boots, worn jeans, leather jacket heavy with rain. His name was Jack Turner. He wasn't the kind of man you'd expect to stop for anyone. His face carried the weight of miles traveled and mistakes made. A scar crossed his left eyebrow, and his eyes, grey and restless, looked like they'd seen too many sunsets through prison bars or bar fights. But beneath that weathered exterior, there was something human, something tired of pretending not to care. Jack crouched, his shadow stretching across the boy. "You lost, kid." His voice was gravel wrapped in warmth, uncertain if it should be gentle or tough. Eli didn't answer. He pulled his knees tighter, eyes darting between the man and the bike, unsure which was more dangerous. Jack sighed, shaking his head. "Figures, the world forgets kids like you." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled sandwich, the kind bikers buy at gas stations between long rides. He handed it over without a word. The boy stared. At it, then at him. "Go on," Jack muttered. "It ain't poison." Eli took it slowly, his small hands trembling. The first bite hit his stomach like fire meeting cold steel. Jack sat down beside him, leaning his back against the church wall. For a while, neither spoke. Only the rain filled the silence. Jack finally said, "You got a name?" The boy hesitated. "Eli." "Eli," Jack repeated, as if testing how it felt on his tongue. "Good name. Strong." He didn't ask for the boy's story. He didn't need to. Some things you can read in the way a person breathes, the hesitations, the small flinches. Jack knew that look. He had worn it once, back when he was the kid everyone crossed the street to avoid. Life had carved the same lines in both of them, just at different ages. "You got anyone?" Jack asked after a pause. Eli shook his head. "Not anymore." Jack nodded slowly. "Yeah, me neither." He looked up at the black sky and exhaled. "Funny how the world's full of people, yet somehow it's the loneliest place on earth." Something inside him shifted then, something he hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was the innocence in the boy's voice, or maybe it was the mirror he saw in him. Either way, it cracked something open. He turned to the kid, his tone softening. "You don't have to be scared, not tonight." Eli blinked. "Why?" "Because I'm here," Jack said simply, "and as long as I'm breathing, you won't be alone." The words came out rough, unplanned, but true. Jack wasn't the kind of man who made promises. He'd learned long ago that they had weight, and weight was something he didn't carry well. But there was something sacred in that moment, something that cut deeper than the storm. For the next few days, Jack stayed. He found an old motel outside of town and paid for a room with the last of his cash. He let the boy clean up, taught him how to fix small things on the bike, how to tell when an engine was lying to you by the way it coughed. He even bought him a worn leather jacket from a thrift store. It hung loose on his shoulders, but the kid wore it like armor. Jack wasn't used to having someone look at him like that, with trust. It scared him more than any fight ever had. There was no hiding in it, no running from it. Eli followed him everywhere, even when Jack tried to act tough or distant. He'd ask questions about the bike, about the road, about freedom. "What's it like out there?" Eli asked once, sitting on the curb as Jack worked on the engine. Jack smirked. "Out there? It's wild, kid. Wind in your face, no rules, no one telling you what you can or can't be." Eli tilted his head. "Sounds lonely." Jack stopped, wrench frozen mid-turn. "Yeah," he said after a pause. "Yeah, it can be." Those words stuck in his throat longer than he expected. Maybe the boy saw something in him that he'd been trying to outrun. Maybe he knew that freedom and loneliness sometimes ride the same road. As the days passed, they became something like family, two broken pieces that accidentally fit. But good things, Jack knew, don't last long in a world built on chaos. It started with a phone call. Old brothers from his club, the Iron Saints, had gotten into trouble again. Drugs, debt, betrayal, the kind of business Jack swore he was done with. But loyalty is a cruel master. You can hate what a man's done, but when he once saved your life, you ride for him one last time. He told himself it'd be quick, just a few days, a favor to settle old debts. He left a few bucks on the motel dresser and told Eli to wait, promising he'd be back before the week was over. The boy stood in the doorway, small and uncertain, clutching the patch Jack had given him, the Iron Saints emblem with faded wings. "You'll come back, right?" Jack hesitated. He wanted to lie. He wanted to say yes and mean it, but something in him knew the road ahead wouldn't make that easy. Still, he forced a smile. "I'll be back, kid. You got my word." The engine roared to life. The rain had stopped, but the clouds hung low, heavy with unspoken things. Jack rode off into the distance, his shadow stretching long behind him. Eli watched until the sound of the motorcycle disappeared completely, swallowed by the wind. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. No sign of Jack. The motel manager kicked Eli out when the money ran dry. He wandered the same streets where Jack once found him, waiting for the sound of that engine that never came. The patch became his only proof that it hadn't been a dream. Meanwhile, Jack's world collapsed faster than he could control. The favor turned into a firefight. His brothers turned on each other, the club splintered, and by the end of it, more graves stood than men. He tried to go back for Eli once, but the guilt was heavier than the distance. Every time he turned the key, something inside him froze. What kind of man keeps a promise when he's not even sure he deserves forgiveness? Years later, when he finally looked at his reflection and didn't recognize the man staring back, that's when he knew the truth. It wasn't the road that broke him, it was the silence after he left. And somewhere in that same small town, the boy he once swore to protect had stopped being a child. He had learned the hard way that promises fade unless you fight to keep them alive. The world kept spinning, unaware that two lives had split that night beneath the storm, one chasing redemption, the other waiting to be rescued from a promise gone cold. But destiny, like the road, has a strange way of circling back when you least expect it, and when the engines roar again, it will bring with it the weight of every word once spoken beneath the rain. The night that changed everything didn't start like a tragedy. It began like any other in the desert outskirts of Reno, engines humming under a red sky, laughter echoing through the cracked walls of the Iron Saints clubhouse, and the scent of cheap whiskey cutting through the heat. Jack Turner sat at the far end of the bar, fingers wrapped around a half-empty bottle, the kind of drink that doesn't taste good, but helps you forget what good even means. His brothers filled the room, men he'd known longer than he'd known peace. They were loud, reckless, proud of their scars. But beneath the noise, Jack felt it, something shifting, a tension in the air that wasn't just smoke and sin. "Can't keep pretending, Jack," one of them said, slamming his glass on the counter. It was Cole, his oldest friend, the one who used to fix bikes and break jaws with the same calm. "This club ain't what it used to be. We're ghosts riding in circles." Jack didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew he was right. The Iron Saints had lost their way. What began as a brotherhood of outcasts had turned into something darker. Gun runs, debts, and dirty deals that blurred the line between survival and destruction. He tried to steer them back once, tried to bring some order to the chaos, but leadership doesn't work when no one's listening. The night ended with shouting, then gunfire. No one remembered who fired first. Maybe it was one of their own, maybe a rival gang looking to settle old scores. All Jack knew was that when the smoke cleared, Cole was on the ground, blood pooling around his cut, and the patch on his back, once a symbol of loyalty, was torn clean through. Jack dropped to his knees beside him, hands trembling. "Stay with me, brother," he whispered. But the words fell heavy, empty. Cole's eyes stared back, unblinking, already somewhere else. That moment split Jack's life in two, before and after. Everything that came after was noise. Sirens in the distance, tires screeching, the chaos of men running from what they'd built. He didn't wait for the cops or the questions. He mounted his bike, revved the engine, and rode into the black, straight through the neon veins of the city until the lights disappeared behind him. He told himself it was for Eli, that walking away was the only way to protect the boy from a man the world was already trying to bury. But the truth, he realized later, was simpler, uglier. He wasn't protecting Eli. He was running from himself. The desert stretched for miles, endless and empty, like punishment. Jack rode through the cracked highways of Nevada, through the forgotten towns of Texas, through the red dust of Arizona. Each mile was supposed to cleanse him, but guilt clung like a second skin. Every gas station mirror reflected the same haunted eyes, and every motel room felt smaller than the one before. Sometimes he'd wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, certain he could still hear Eli's voice calling his name through the rain. "You'll come back, right?" That question followed him more faithfully than any brother ever had. He tried to lose himself in the rhythm of the road. There's a kind of meditation in movement, in the way the world blurs when you stop looking too closely. But even the wind began to sound like memory. He started talking, to himself, or maybe to the boy who wasn't there. "You're better off without me, kid. You deserve someone who ain't built from mistakes." Jack drifted between jobs, mechanic, bouncer, truck hand, never staying long enough to grow roots. The people he met saw only what he allowed them to. A quiet man with a scar and a stare that warned others not to ask. But inside, his thoughts were constant noise. Regret isn't loud at first. It starts as a whisper, a single thought replaying over and over until it's all you hear. In a rundown diner in New Mexico, he met a waitress who told him something he never forgot. She looked him straight in the eye and said, "You can't outrun what's already riding behind you." He didn't respond, but the words hit him harder than any fist ever had. Years passed like broken pages. The world changed. New bikes, new roads, but Jack didn't. He still carried the same patch, folded and faded, in the pocket of his jacket. The Iron Saints were long gone, but their ghosts rode with him. Sometimes he'd park his bike on a hill overlooking some nameless town and watch the sunset bleed into the horizon, wondering if Eli had grown taller, if he still waited, if he even remembered. There were nights when he almost turned back. He'd start the bike, heart pounding, headlights cutting through the dark. But then the voice in his head would whisper, "You'll only break him again." And he'd stop. He always stopped. That was the twisted part about guilt. It convinces you that staying away is kindness, that disappearing is mercy. But mercy without truth is just another lie. The more time passed, the heavier his silence became. He began writing letters he never sent, crumpled papers filled with words like, "I'm sorry," and "You deserved better," and "I still see your face every time I close my eyes." Sometimes he'd burn them. Sometimes he'd just let them scatter into the wind, as if the desert could carry his confession somewhere the boy might hear. One night, outside a mechanic shop in Amarillo, a kid about Eli's age tried to steal his bike. Jack caught him before he could start it. The kid froze, terrified, and for a second Jack saw those same eyes, wide, desperate, hungry for a way out. He didn't yell. He just tossed the kid a sandwich from his saddlebag and said quietly, "Don't end up like me." The boy ran off, and Jack sat there for a long time after, the engine idling beside him, the smell of fuel thick in the air. It wasn't until dawn that he realized the truth he'd been avoiding. He wasn't cursed. He was choosing to stay broken. Every decision had led him further from the man he wanted to be. But the strange thing about life, the hidden truth behind every redemption story, is that sometimes the very thing you run from becomes the only thing that can save you. Jack didn't know it yet, but the road was already leading him back to where it all began. The weight of years had carved lines across his face, but time hadn't dulled the guilt. It had only sharpened it. Every storm he rode through felt like the one that started it all. Every frightened child he passed on the roadside reminded him of Eli under that church step. In Nevada, he worked for a mechanic who rebuilt old Harleys. One evening, while cleaning out a forgotten storage room, Jack found a photograph pinned to the wall, an old black and white of a biker kneeling beside a little boy, their faces turned toward the sun. The image hit him like a punch. For a moment, the room spun, and he realized how much of his life he'd lived like a man half awake, trapped between past and present. He started noticing things then, signs, coincidences that felt like messages. A kid wearing the same brand of jacket he once bought for Eli. A song playing on a jukebox with lyrics about broken promises. Maybe they were nothing, or maybe the world was trying to tell him that running wasn't the same as healing. He began to talk to himself more often on those long, silent highways. "You can't change what's done," he'd murmur, "but maybe you can still change what comes next." There was one place he kept circling back to in his mind, the town he'd left behind, the boy who'd believed in him. He pictured Eli older now, hardened by the same world that shaped him. Maybe he'd found trouble, or maybe he'd found strength. Either way, the idea that he might still be out there became the only thing that gave Jack purpose. He didn't call it redemption. He didn't even call it hope. It was more like gravity, something unseen but impossible to escape. Each mile pulled him closer to the truth, to the decision he'd avoided for years. And deep down, he knew, every road, no matter how far it stretches, eventually loops back to where it began. You can fight it, deny it, curse it, but the road always wins. The night he realized he couldn't keep running, the wind felt different, less like a warning, more like a whisper. He didn't know what waited for him back there, or if the boy would even remember his name. But he did know one thing. Some promises don't die when they're broken. They just wait for the right moment to be made whole again. And somewhere beyond the horizon, that moment was already waking up, engine by engine, heartbeat by heartbeat, ready to bring everything Jack Turner had buried back to life. The town hadn't changed much. Maybe the paint peeled a little more, maybe the streets grew quieter, but the same stillness hung in the air like dust that refused to settle. It was the kind of place that swallowed dreams and spit out survivors. And among those survivors was Eli. The frightened boy who once hid from the rain behind a church wall was now 17, tall but underfed, with hands calloused from lifting scrap metal and eyes too old for his face. He worked in Vince Harper's scrapyard, a graveyard of broken machines and broken men, tucked at the edge of town, where the air smelled like rust and gasoline. The job wasn't really a job. It was a trap. Vince took in kids one would miss, runaways, drifters, the kind who didn't have papers or parents. He'd feed them enough to keep them standing, pay them just enough to keep them hoping, and remind them every day that they owed him more than they ever could repay. "You eat 'cause I let you," he'd say, tossing a can of beans across the table. "You sleep 'cause I don't throw you out. Don't forget that, boy." And Eli never did. He kept his head down, did his work, and hid his anger behind silence. Sometimes at night, when the others had fallen asleep in the bunkhouse, Eli would take out a small piece of fabric from his pocket, the biker patch Jack had given him years ago. The edges were frayed, the color faded, but the words were still clear. Ride true. He didn't fully understand what those words meant anymore. Maybe they were a promise, maybe they were a curse. But every time he held that patch, he could almost hear the rumble of an engine far away, like a heartbeat reminding him that somewhere out there, someone once cared enough to say, "You'll never be alone again." He would whisper into the dark, "You lied, Jack." But the anger didn't sound real anymore. It was softer now, worn out, like everything else in his life. The scrapyard was a cruel teacher. Every bent nail and cracked mirror reflected the kind of world Eli had learned to navigate. A world built on deals, on silence, on knowing when to keep your head down. Vince liked to pit the boys against each other, feeding them scraps of money and approval like bones to stray dogs. "Life's about who's got the guts to take what he wants," Vince would sneer, slamming his boot into the dirt. "No one's giving you a damn thing." But Eli knew better. He'd seen what real strength looked like once. A man who stopped for a scared kid in the rain, and though he didn't say it out loud, that memory became his quiet rebellion. He didn't steal from the others. He didn't fight unless he had to. He worked harder, thought sharper, planned further. Somewhere deep inside, he believed that if he kept holding on, if he kept pushing forward, something would change. That was his mindset. The kind of faith that isn't loud or holy, but stubborn. Every decision he made after that came from one thought: I won't become him. Not Vince. Not the men who use others to fill the hole inside them. But surviving with dignity in a place like that was a dangerous form of defiance. Vince noticed. One afternoon, under a sun that made the metal shimmer like fire, Vince caught Eli giving an old man a bottle of water. The man was homeless, wandering near the gate, weak and trembling. "We don't feed strays," Vince snapped, yanking the bottle from Eli's hand. "You think kindness keeps the lights on here?" Eli met his eyes, and for the first time, he didn't look away. "Maybe not," he said quietly, "but it keeps you human." That was the day Vince decided to break him. He started giving Eli the worst jobs: hauling twisted steel, working late nights near the sea, crusher, loading trucks alone. It wasn't just punishment, it was control. But Eli didn't break. Every cut on his hands became a reminder that he was still fighting. Every bruise was proof that he hadn't given up. There's a strange kind of transformation that happens when pain becomes purpose. Eli began to understand things about the world that no teacher could explain. The hidden truth that cruelty often masks fear, that power without empathy is weakness pretending to be strength. And maybe, maybe that lesson was the gift Jack Turner left him, even without meaning to. He'd sometimes stare at the horizon beyond the junkyard fence, where the highway disappeared into heat and distance. That's where he imagined Jack riding, somewhere between freedom and forgiveness. He didn't know why he still thought about him, but he did. The idea that the man might still be out there kept him from sinking completely. It gave meaning to the noise of the machines and the long, silent nights. Inside, Eli carried two versions of himself: the boy who waited and the young man who no longer expected anyone to come. That conflict burned quietly, shaping him into something new. He didn't see it as growth, but it was. The resilience he forged in that scrapyard would later become his armor, though he couldn't know it yet. Sometimes he'd overhear Vince and his men talking in the office, words muffled through the thin walls, deals about stolen bikes, stripped engines, and deliveries made at midnight. He didn't care much at first, until he recognized a name, one that made his blood run cold. "Turner," Vince said once, laughing. "That washed-up biker from the old Iron Saints. Heard he's somewhere in Arizona, still breathing somehow." Eli froze where he stood, the wrench slipping from his hand. He hadn't heard that name in years. The sound of it was like a door opening he thought was sealed shut. Jack Turner, the man who promised him safety and disappeared into the storm. The man whose absence had defined his entire life. That night, Eli couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the patch clutched in his hand. For the first time, he didn't whisper in anger. Instead, he whispered a question. "Are you really still out there?" The thought that Jack might be alive brought something unfamiliar to his chest, hope mixed with resentment. It was messy, painful, but alive. Vince noticed the change. He saw the distraction, the spark. To a man like him, curiosity was dangerous. It meant independence, so he tightened the leash. "You think too much, kid," he growled one morning, slamming a greasy ledger onto the table. "Thinking gets you in trouble. Just keep your head down and do your job." Eli nodded, but inside he was already planning. He didn't know what he'd do if he ever found Jack again, whether he'd forgive him or demand an answer. But something inside him was shifting, a decision forming quietly, like dawn behind a storm. Every night he'd stare at the horizon, the glow of the scrapyard fires painting his face in flickering light. He'd imagine the sound of an engine, faint and distant. He'd imagine the road stretching endlessly westward toward deserts and redemption, and the truth that waited behind it all. In that darkness, something profound began to take root. Not just survival, but belief. Belief that life wasn't over just because it hurt, that the pain could become purpose, the struggle a kind of preparation. He didn't know it, but this was the start of his transformation. One night after Vince's men left, Eli climbed onto an old, rusted bike that hadn't run in years. He sat there in silence, gripping the handlebars, imagining what it would feel like to ride away, to taste the wind, to feel something other than fear. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Ride true," the same words from Jack's patch. It felt like a prayer and a promise all at once. The next morning, the sky was heavy with dust and the smell of oil. The world looked the same, but Eli didn't. He moved with quiet certainty, his eyes sharper, his mind clear. Somewhere deep down, he knew that every hardship he endured was leading him to something, maybe confrontation, maybe freedom, maybe both. And though he didn't know it yet, the sound he'd been waiting to hear for years, the thunder of engines, was already echoing beyond the desert, faint but growing, like the start of a storm rolling back toward the town that time had forgotten. The night was quiet in the Arizona desert, one of those still, endless nights where even the wind seems to stop breathing. The stars burned like old memories, scattered across the sky, and the road stretched ahead in silence, cracked and forgotten. Jack Turner sat outside a run-down gas station, the kind that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. His bike leaned against the wall beside him, rust creeping up the tank, a ghost of what it once was. He hadn't ridden in weeks, maybe months. The engine that once roared through highways now felt like a relic, just like the man who owned it. He'd spent too long running from the noise in his own head. Every town, every motel, every bottle had become part of the same pattern, a life built on escape. But that night, something shifted. A pickup truck rolled in, its headlights cutting through the dust. The driver was a mechanic Jack had met years ago on the road, a drifter like himself, with grease under his nails and too many stories to tell. The man got out, nodded, and said, "Didn't expect to see you still breathing, Turner." Jack smirked, half amused, half bitter. "Yeah, well, guess death's still deciding what to do with me." The mechanic laughed, but then his tone changed, softening into something almost careful. "You ever think about that kid you took in, the one from that little town out west?" Jack froze. The words hit like gravel against bone. "Eli." The man nodded slowly. "He's still there. Works for some bastard named Vince Harper. Real piece of work. Runs a scrapyard. Uses kids like slaves. I passed through a few months back. The boy's older now, maybe 17, 18, looks tired, like someone who's waiting on a promise that ain't ever coming." Jack didn't answer right away. His throat tightened, and the air seemed heavier. For years, he had imagined Eli growing up somewhere safe, maybe adopted by a good family, maybe even forgetting him. That illusion had been the only thing that made the guilt bearable. But now, it cracked wide open. "You..." "Sure it's him?" he finally asked, though deep down he already knew. The mechanic shrugged. Kid had a patch in his pocket, said it used to belong to someone who swore he'd come back. That was all it took. The sound of the mechanic's truck fading into the distance left behind an echo that felt like destiny itself. Jack sat there, staring at his bike in the dim light. The same bike that had carried him away from everything. The same bike that had become his confession booth, his prison, and his only witness. The leather seat was torn, the chrome dull with age, but it was still there, waiting. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cold metal. "Guess it's time," he muttered. The words barely left his lips, but they carried more truth than anything he'd said in years. He stood up slowly, shoulders heavy, heart even heavier, and looked out toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond that line was a boy he'd left behind, and a version of himself he'd buried with him. The decision wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost tender, like a man finally surrendering to the thing he'd been resisting his whole life. He rolled the bike forward, checked the oil, tightened a few bolts that hadn't been touched in years. His hands moved on instinct, the old rhythm still there, muscle memory born from years of fixing what was broken. And maybe that was the irony. After all this time, the one thing he couldn't fix was himself. When he turned the key, the engine coughed, sputtered, then came alive. The roar filled the night like a heartbeat waking from a coma. He closed his eyes and let the vibration travel through him, shaking off the dust of years spent in silence. For the first time in a long time, he felt something close to purpose, redemption maybe, or just the simple clarity of a man who finally knew where he needed to go. "I'm coming home, kid," he whispered. The road accepted him without judgment. The wind hit his face like forgiveness. Each mile was a memory of laughter by the fire, of Cole's last breath, of the storm that started it all. But beneath the pain, something else stirred, a spark he hadn't felt in years. That's the hidden truth about guilt. When you finally stop running from it, it starts to show you the way back. Jack didn't call anyone, he didn't plan. He just rode, through ghost towns and deserts, past motels where neon signs blinked like dying stars. He rode through the places where the Iron Saints once gathered, where loyalty had turned into blood and regret. And though the ghosts whispered his name, he didn't stop. He couldn't. Every turn of the wheel felt like penance. Every passing mile, a small piece of his soul clawing its way out of exile. Sometimes he'd talk out loud to the empty air. "You probably hate me, Eli. Can't blame you." The wind swallowed his words, but he spoke anyway. "I thought I was protecting you, keeping you away from all this. But I was just afraid you'd see what kind of man I really was." The journey became something more than distance. It became transformation, the kind of change that doesn't come from time or forgiveness, but from truth. He realized that redemption isn't found in what you fix, it's found in what you face. Every gas station, every diner, every stranger he met reminded him of the world he'd abandoned, the people he'd stopped caring about when the pain got too loud. In a small town near the Texas border, he stopped at a diner just before dawn. The waitress poured his coffee without asking. Maybe she recognized the look in his eyes. "You heading somewhere, or just running?" she asked. Jack smiled faintly. "Maybe both." She nodded as if she understood. "Funny thing about running," she said. "Sometimes it brings you right back to where you were meant to be." That line stuck with him for miles. He thought about the hidden symmetry of life, the way decisions we make in fear have a strange way of circling back to test us again. He thought about Eli, how the boy must have learned to survive without him, how the world must have carved its lessons deep into his skin. But what haunted him most was the image of that patch, the one that said, "Ride true." He'd given it to Eli as a symbol of hope, but now it felt like a debt. Jack knew the road ahead wouldn't be simple. Men like Vince Harper didn't surrender power without a fight. And Eli might not even want to see him, but he also knew something had to change. There comes a moment in every man's life when silence becomes heavier than action, when doing nothing hurts more than the risk of failing. That was the moment Jack Turner faced on that desert highway. The more he rode, the more the world began to look different. The same deserts that once felt empty now looked alive. Cacti reaching like sentinels, the air shimmering with light. It wasn't beauty he saw, it was awareness. A revelation that everything he thought was gone was still here, waiting for him to notice. That's the thing about redemption. It's not something you chase. It's something that waits quietly until you're ready to meet it halfway. He crossed into New Mexico just as the sun began to rise, the horizon glowing orange and gold. The road ahead seemed endless, but for the first time it didn't scare him. He felt the pull of something bigger than regret, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with making things perfect and everything to do with making them right. He didn't have a plan for what he'd say when he found Eli. Maybe there were no words that could fix what years of silence had done, but he had the road and he had the truth, and sometimes that's enough. The bike roared louder as he accelerated, dust swirling behind him like smoke from an old fire reigniting. Every vibration of the engine felt like a pulse beneath his ribs, a reminder that he was still alive, still capable of change. He wasn't sure if it was redemption calling him home, or fate giving him one last chance to prove he hadn't been forgotten by the world. Either way, he didn't look back, because the moment he decided to ride again, something deep within him came alive. The man he used to be, the man he still could be. And as the desert wind rose around him, it carried a whisper that sounded almost like the boy's voice, faint, distant, but real. You'll never be alone again. Jack tightened his grip on the handlebars, eyes locked on the road ahead. The journey wasn't over. In truth, it had just begun. The road stretched forward like a confession yet to be spoken, and somewhere beyond that horizon, a promise was waiting to be kept. The road home didn't start with a destination, it started with an ache, a pull somewhere deep in Jack's chest that told him he couldn't do it alone. Redemption was never meant to be a solo journey, and the ghosts he'd left behind wouldn't let him forget that. The farther he rode, the more he realized this wasn't just about one boy. It was about every promise he'd ever broken, every brother he'd left. Bleeding in the dirt, every piece of his soul he'd scattered across the map. He headed east first, into the kind of country where the horizon stretches forever and the silence feels like judgment. That's where he found Mac. Once, Mac had been the loudest voice in the Iron Saints, the man who could turn a bar fight into poetry, who laughed in the face of danger and rode faster than fear itself. But now the man who opened the door looked older, smaller somehow. The tattoos had faded, the spark dulled. He was living in a trailer parked behind a half-dead bar, the smell of oil and regret thick in the air. Jack didn't start with apologies. Men like them didn't need explanations. They read truth in the eyes, not the words. "Need your help," Jack said simply. "Kid I once swore to protect. He's in trouble." Mac studied him for a long moment before taking a slow drag from his cigarette. "You finally going back, huh?" His tone wasn't mocking, just tired. "Didn't think you had it in you." "Neither did I," Jack admitted. Something flickered in Mac's eyes, maybe forgiveness, maybe nostalgia. He crushed the cigarette beneath his boot and gave a dry laugh. "You know, I'm done with that life." Jack nodded. "So was I. But some debts don't die easy." Mac turned toward the old Harley in the corner of the yard, covered in dust and spider webs. He stared at it like a relic of another man's story. "You think this is gonna fix what we broke?" he asked quietly. "No," Jack said. "But it's a start." Mac's hand lingered on the bike's handlebar. Then, without another word, he grabbed his tools. By the next morning, the sound of that old engine filled the yard again. Uneven at first, then steady, alive. Mac looked up at Jack with a half-smile. "Damn thing still rides. Guess we're both too stubborn to quit." They rode together into the wind. Two ghosts, reborn. But Jack knew they'd need more. The road to redemption, like the road to hell, never runs empty. Next, they found Reyes, the man who used to wear his faith on his vest instead of his sleeve. He'd been the spiritual compass of the club back in the day, preaching about loyalty even when the world gave him reasons not to. Now he worked at a roadside chapel outside Albuquerque, fixing bikes for travelers who couldn't pay and quoting scripture that didn't judge, only warned. Reyes was bent over an engine when Jack and Mac pulled in. He didn't look up, just muttered, "Didn't think I'd ever hear those pipes again." Jack took off his helmet, eyes downcast. "Didn't think I'd ever start them again?" Reyes stood, wiping his hands on a rag. His gaze lingered on Jack's worn leather jacket, then on Mac's weathered face. "You here for forgiveness or trouble?" "Both," Jack said. "Mostly trouble." Reyes smirked. "That tracks." They sat for hours, drinking cheap coffee and talking about the years between. Jack told him about Eli, the boy who still believed in a man who didn't deserve it. For a moment, the air went still. Then, Reyes sighed, the kind of sigh that carries the weight of years. "That boy's the only thing pure that ever came out of our mess. You bring him back into this world. You better do it right." Jack nodded. "That's the plan." Reyes looked toward the chapel, its small cross catching the morning sun. "You know what I told God when I left the club," he said softly, "that I'd never ride again unless it was for something holy." He paused, eyes narrowing on Jack. "This feels close enough." By the time they left, the chapel's doors were still open, and the rumble of 3 engines echoed through the desert like thunder rolling over dry land. The last stop was the hardest. Hawk. If Jack was the heart of the old club, Hawk had been its fire. Reckless, fearless, and always 2 seconds from exploding. He'd vanished after Cole's death, disappearing into rumors and shadows. Jack found him in a border-town garage, working as a mechanic for smugglers who didn't ask questions. The moment Hawk saw him, the air turned electric. "You've got some nerve showing your face here," Hawk growled, wiping grease from his hands. "After what happened to Cole, I swore I'd put you in the ground if I ever saw you again." Jack didn't move. "You can try, but not before you hear me out." Hawk laughed, a sound without humor. "Still the same, huh? Always thinking you can talk your way through the wreckage." "This isn't about me," Jack said. "It's about a boy who needs saving, and I can't do it without you." For a long moment, silence. Then Hawk threw his wrench across the floor and paced, the old fury rising and fading like waves. "You always knew how to pick a fight worth bleeding for," he muttered, "and you always waited until the world was burning before asking for help." Jack met his eyes. "Maybe that's the only time men like us remember who we are." The tension broke. Hawk ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. "You really think one ride can make up for all this?" "No," Jack said. "But it can make it mean something." That was all it took. Hawk stared at him for a long moment, then let out a long, exhausted laugh. "Damn you, Turner. You still know how to twist the knife." By sunset, the 4 of them stood together again for the first time in over a decade. Older, rougher, each one carrying the scars of his own war. They didn't talk about forgiveness. They didn't talk about the past. They just looked at each other, at the road ahead, and knew. When the engines roared to life, it wasn't just noise, it was resurrection. The sound shook through the desert, wild and defiant, as if the earth itself was remembering their names. They stopped at a diner before crossing state lines, sitting in their old formation. Jack at the head of the booth, Mac cracking jokes, Reyes saying grace over cold coffee, and Hawk pretending not to care while listening to every word. For a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. But beneath the laughter was something deeper, a shared understanding. That this was their last ride, the one that would define everything that came before. Jack looked at each of them, his voice low but steady. "This isn't about vengeance. It's about making something right that should have never gone wrong." Reyes nodded. "Then we ride with purpose." Mac grinned. "One last time." And Hawk, who had said nothing for minutes, finally looked up. "For the boy," he said. "For what we were supposed to be." Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in orange and gold, and their shadows stretched long across the asphalt. There was a sense of inevitability in the air, a quiet knowing that this road would either destroy them or save them. But for the first time in years, Jack didn't care which. He felt something stirring deep inside, something he hadn't felt since that rainy night with Eli, a spark of meaning, of direction. Redemption wasn't a word he used lightly, but now it felt real, close enough to touch. Every mile ahead was a promise whispered back to life. As they rolled out of the diner's parking lot, the neon sign flickered behind them, half-lit and buzzing. It read, "Open," but it might as well have said, "Alive." The engines harmonized into a single thunderous growl, and the road stretched before them like a confession waiting to be spoken. The desert wind carried the scent of rain again, the kind that always comes before a storm. And as the first drops hit the dusty highway, Jack looked toward the horizon, eyes sharp, heart steady. He wasn't just riding toward a town. He was riding toward every version of himself he had ever left behind. And somewhere ahead, beneath the same sky that once watched a scared boy hide from the world, destiny was waiting, louder than guilt, stronger than regret, and burning like the roar of engines that refused to forget what they were built for. The town looked smaller than Jack remembered, like time had drained the color out of it and left only shadows behind. The main street was almost empty, a skeleton of what it used to be, flickering signs, boarded-up stores, and the soft hum of a neon bar light fighting the darkness. The wind carried the smell of dust and rusted metal, the kind that clings to your skin long after you've left. Somewhere in the distance, the scrapyard gates groaned against their hinges, the metallic echo spreading through the night like a warning no one wanted to hear. Jack and the others parked their bikes on a ridge overlooking the town. From up there, they could see everything: the crooked church spire, the diner where he once stopped with Eli, the long road that led to Vince Harper's empire of scrap and greed. It was strange how a place could look both familiar and foreign at the same time, like returning to a dream that had rotted at the edges. The brothers stood in silence for a while. Mac leaned on his bike, scanning the town below. "You sure the kid's still here?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. Jack didn't take his eyes off the horizon. "Yeah, he's here, I can feel it." Hawk kicked at the dirt, his impatience as loud as his engine. "You really think a bunch of old men on motorcycles are going to scare a guy like Vince? That bastard's been running this place unchecked for years." Jack turned to him, the ghost of a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We're not here to scare him. We're here to remind him what fear looks like." Reyes looked toward the scrapyard, the faint glow of firelight flickering over its jagged fences. "You think this is justice, Jack?" Jack's answer came without hesitation. "No, justice is clean. This is redemption, and redemption's never clean." Down in the town, Vince Harper sat in his office, a whiskey glass sweating in his hand. The scrapyard buzzed with noise, trucks unloading, men shouting orders, the clank of metal on metal. He'd heard rumors earlier that day, whispers that the old Iron Saints were back, that Turner had been seen crossing state lines with his crew. Vince laughed it off. "Those relics?" he sneered, looking over at his foreman. "If they're smart, they'll keep riding. This ain't the kind of town that welcomes ghosts." But somewhere deep inside, a memory stirred. He'd been younger once, reckless, and he remembered those same men thundering through highways like a storm. Back then, their name meant something. He poured himself another drink, shaking the thought away. "Old men don't scare me," he muttered. "They break easy." Outside, the night thickened. Clouds rolled in, heavy and grey, the kind that promised rain but delivered thunder instead. From the hills, the wind began to shift. At first, it was just a faint vibration in the air, the kind you could mistake for imagination. Then came the sound, low, steady, growing, the unmistakable rhythm of engines waking from their graves. Vince paused mid-sip, frowning. "What the hell is that?" The foreman shrugged, stepping toward the window. "Probably trucks on the highway." But it wasn't trucks. It was something older, heavier, charged with meaning. The rumble grew deeper, rolling through the valley like a memory too powerful to stay buried. Vince set his glass down, his pulse quickening. On the ridge, Jack tightened his gloves, the leather worn but still strong. He looked at the men around him, brothers bound not by blood, but by scars. Mac revved his engine once, the sound splitting the air. Reyes closed his eyes, whispering something that could have been a prayer or a curse. Hawk cracked his neck and smirked. "Let's wake the town." Jack kicked his bike to life. The engine roared like thunder reborn. One light flicked on, then another, then another. Down below, the town began to glow, as if the stars themselves had descended upon it, headlights piercing through the darkness one by one until the hills looked alive. 10 bikes became 20, 20 became 50, then 100. The roar of steel and wind merged into a single pulse, shaking the ground. People came out of their houses drawn by the sound. Some thought it was a storm, others a miracle. Mothers held their children close. Old men stepped onto porches, eyes wide, recognizing the symphony of engines they hadn't heard in decades. The first bikes came into view, cutting through the main road like a river of chrome and lightning. Dust rose behind them, swirling in the beams of their headlights. At the front rode Jack Turner, his expression calm but unyielding, the weight of every decision carved into the lines of his face. Behind him, the brothers rode side by side, their jackets bearing the faded mark of the Iron Saints. In that moment, time seemed to slow. The town, once lifeless, now pulsed with energy. The air buzzed with the sound of return, not revenge, not rage, but resurrection. It wasn't just about Eli anymore. It was about the promise they'd made to each other, to stand for something real when the world forgot what that meant. Vince's men scrambled to the gates of the scrapyard. "Boss, they're coming," one of them shouted. Vince stepped outside, the glow of his cigar flickering in the dark. He squinted at the approaching lights, disbelief twisting into arrogance. "Let them come," he said. "They think this is still their world. They'll learn fast." But as the first wave of bikers thundered past the edge of town, the ground itself seemed to answer back. The sound was alive, ancient, a song of rebellion, of brotherhood, of men who refused to stay dead. Each engine carried its own history, its own pain, its own redemption. Together, they became something unstoppable. Jack's eyes stayed fixed on the scrapyard gates. "He's in there," he said to himself, the words lost beneath the roar. "And so is my past." Beside him, Mac shouted over the noise, "What's the plan?" Jack didn't hesitate. "We ride in. We make him see the cost of forgetting what honor looks like." The wind tore through their jackets, carrying dust and echoes. The headlights stretched across the asphalt like veins of light, guiding them forward. Every sound, the hum of the engines, the creak of leather, the steady rhythm of tires, became part of something bigger. This wasn't violence for the sake of it. This was a reckoning. From a distance, the town looked like a painting. Dark sky above, streaks of light below, and the faint shimmer of rain beginning to fall. Each drop hit the ground and caught the reflection of a headlight, like stars returning to earth. The symbolism wasn't lost on Jack. "Full circle," he murmured. They reached the edge of the scrapyard, engines idling like beasts waiting for release. Jack looked around at his brothers. "We do this clean. No chaos, no blood unless there's no other way." Reyes gave a small nod. "Then let's make it mean something." Max smirked, his voice rough but steady. "Been waiting a long time to hear that." The gates loomed ahead, rusted, tall, and locked. Vince's men stood behind them, clutching bats, pipes, and fear disguised as courage. The foreman shouted something, but his voice was swallowed by the roar that followed. Jack twisted the throttle, his bike lurching forward as lightning split the sky. The rain hit harder now, soaking the ground, turning the dirt into mud. The world smelled of iron and promise. And then, with a single motion, the Iron Saints surged forward. The gates didn't stand a chance. Chains snapped, metal screamed, and the roar of engines drowned out everything else. The town, for one suspended moment, watched as a piece of history came back to life. This wasn't just an arrival, it was an awakening, a reminder that even in a forgotten corner of America, where cruelty had taken root, there were still men who carried the old codes in their hearts. Vince stumbled back as the headlights filled his yard. The storm finally broke overhead, rain crashing down as if the heavens themselves were watching. Jack dismounted slowly, boots sinking into the mud, his silhouette framed by 100 beams of light. He took a breath, every part of him steady now. "You took what wasn't yours," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the rain. "But tonight, we take something back." The storm answered with thunder, and as the brothers closed in, the rain washed over them all, turning dirt into reflection, fear into revelation, and the sound of engines into a hymn that the town would never forget. The lights burned brighter, the roar deeper, the tension sharper. Every man knew what was coming, but none dared move, because in that moment, something larger than vengeance filled the air, something that felt like justice finally catching up to time itself. And through the wind, through the roar and the rain, the ghosts of the past began to whisper, voices carried by thunder, reminding the world that redemption, once awakened, doesn't fade quietly. The rain didn't stop. It came down harder, relentless, as if the sky itself wanted to wash the town clean. The ground beneath the bikers' boots turned to mud, slick and heavy, carrying the scent of oil and rust. The roar of the engines faded into a low hum as Jack stepped forward, the rain streaming down his face, his jacket darkened and heavy. His brothers stood behind him, silent but ready, their presence alone enough to make the air feel charged. Across from them, Vince and his men lined up under the scrapyard lights, thugs with iron rods, chains, and the kind of hollow courage that comes from following a cruel man's orders. The glare from the floodlights cut across, their faces sharp and unforgiving. Vince lit a cigar with slow, exaggerated ease, pretending not to care. "You think you're some kind of heroes?" he said, his voice loud enough to slice through the rain. He took a long drag, the ember glowing like a small sun in the dark. "You ride in here, scare a few kids with your little nostalgia parade, and think the world's gonna bend to you again. That time's over." Jack didn't blink. "We're not heroes," he said, his tone quiet but steady. "Just men who finally kept their word." For a second, no one moved. The rain drummed on the metal, a steady rhythm that mirrored the tension between them. Mac shifted his weight, eyes locked on the guards at the gate. Hawk rolled his shoulders, his knuckles cracking. Reyes murmured something that sounded like a prayer. Vince smirked and stepped closer, the mud squelching under his boots. "Word," he said, spitting the word like it was poison. "You really came all this way for a word. You think that boy still cares about promises? He works for me now. He's part of this world, my world, the kind that doesn't believe in fairy tales or second chances." Jack's jaw tightened. "He's not yours to keep. You think you're saving him." Vince laughed. "You're just reminding him how easily people leave. You walked away once. You'll do it again. That's what men like you do." The truth behind the insult hit deep, but Jack didn't flinch. He'd lived with those words in his head for years. He'd tried to outrun them, bury them, drown them, but now, under the cold rain and flickering lights, they didn't sting the same way. They just confirmed what he already knew, that redemption was never about erasing the past. It was about owning it. "I left because I thought it would protect him," Jack said. His voice carried through the scrapyard, steady as thunder. "But I was wrong. Protecting someone means standing between them and the fire, not running from it." Vince sneered. "You always did talk like some preacher on a bike. But this ain't church, old man. This is business. And in my business, people like you end up buried in the dirt you came from." Jack took a step forward, rain dripping from his brow, his boots sinking deeper into the mud. "Then you don't understand what kind of men you're dealing with." Before Vince could respond, one of his men lunged forward, swinging a metal pipe. Jack sidestepped with precision, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it until the pipe dropped with a thud. The move was Fast, efficient, not born from rage but purpose. The fight ignited like a spark to gasoline. Engines revved behind the Iron Saints, as if answering the call. Mac charged first, his shoulder slamming into two of Vince's men, sending them sprawling into the dirt. Hawk swung a chain he'd ripped from the fence, the sound cutting through the rain like a whip. Reyes stayed near Jack, moving with a kind of calm intensity, every motion measured, almost surgical. Vince's men outnumbered them 2-1, but numbers couldn't match conviction. The fight wasn't clean. It wasn't meant to be. It was raw, desperate, filled with the sound of fists against flesh, metal clanging, and the grunts of men fighting not just for a cause, but for something that went deeper, for memory, for loyalty, for the last fragments of their better selves. Jack found himself face to face with Vince. The noise around them faded into a blur. The world seemed to shrink to just the two of them, the man who'd taken everything, good from this town, and the man who had once left it behind. Vince swung first, heavy and wild. Jack blocked, his movements grounded in experience, in a lifetime of knowing that some fights aren't about winning, they're about not backing down. "You don't get it, do you?" Vince snarled, striking again. "This world doesn't belong to men like you anymore." Jack caught Vince's wrist mid-swing, forcing him back. "Then maybe it's time someone took it back." They struggled, slipping in the mud, fists flying, both men grunting with effort. Each punch carried more than anger. It carried years of failure, guilt, and the need to finally make something right. Through the chaos, Eli appeared at the edge of the yard, drawn by the noise and the glow of headlights. He froze when he saw Jack, his jacket soaked, his face bloodied but unbroken. For a moment, the world stopped moving. The boy he'd once been and the man he'd become stared across the years that had separated them. Jack saw recognition in Eli's eyes. Shock first, then anger, then something softer, something that hurt more than any punch could. The rain dripped from the boy's hair as he whispered, "You came back." Jack almost smiled, even as Vince tried to swing again. "Told you I would," he said between breaths. Eli moved closer, his fists clenched. "Why now?" Jack blocked another hit, shoving Vince back against a pile of rusted scrap. "Because I finally learned what keeping a promise means." Behind them, the fight raged on. The Iron Saints moved as one, their rhythm brutal but disciplined. The roar of engines and thunder mixed together, turning the scene into something cinematic, almost unreal. Sparks flew as a chain hit metal, the air glowing briefly before the darkness swallowed it again. Vince's men began to fall back. Some ran, others hesitated, their courage dissolving under the sight of bikers who refused to yield. It wasn't rage driving the Iron Saints. It was something purer, deeper, the kind of strength that comes from men who have already lost everything and still choose to stand. Jack finally landed a blow that sent Vince crashing into the mud. The man gasped for air, his cigar crushed beneath his boot. Jack stood over him, breathing hard. "You built this place on pain," he said quietly. "But the thing about pain, it doesn't stay loyal. It turns on you." Vince spat blood, glaring up at him. "You think this changes anything? You think the world gives a damn about your little crusade?" Jack knelt, down, his face inches from Vince's. "Maybe not, but that boy does, and that's enough." He didn't hit him again. He didn't need to. Sometimes the most powerful blow is the one you choose not to throw. He stood, letting the rain do the rest, washing the mud, the blood, the years off his skin. The noise slowly quieted. Vince's men dropped their weapons, stepping back as the Iron Saints surrounded the yard. The fight was over, though none of them said it out loud. Eli stepped forward, his voice trembling but clear. "You shouldn't have come. He would have killed you." Jack turned to him, the faintest trace of a smile forming. "Maybe, but I'd rather die keeping my word than live breaking it again." For a moment, the only sound was the rain tapping against the metal. Eli's gaze softened. The anger that had once defined him melted into something else. Understanding, maybe even pride. He took a step closer, then another, until he stood just a few feet away. "I thought you forgot about me," Eli said quietly. Jack shook his head. Never. I just had to find the man I promised you I'd be. That sentence lingered in the air, heavier than the storm. Around them, the others stood silent, watching not just a reunion, but a transformation. Two lives colliding, rewriting each other in real time. Reyes whispered something to Mac, who nodded. The brothers exchanged looks, unspoken understanding passing between them. This wasn't the end of a fight. It was the beginning of something bigger. The real battle wasn't against Vince or his men. It was against the weight of who they used to be. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the yard in bursts of silver and shadow. The rain began to ease, tapering off into a soft drizzle. The world felt still, like it was holding its breath. Jack glanced at the horizon, the faint glow of dawn beginning to break through the clouds. He looked back at Eli, his voice rough but steady. "It's over now." Eli shook his head. "No, it's just starting." Jack followed his gaze toward the distant hills. The night had quieted, but in the silence there was still movement. Shadows of men regrouping, whispers of unfinished business. The storm had passed, but the reckoning was far from over. And as the first rays of morning touched the town, Jack realized that redemption doesn't end with victory. It begins with what you do after the fight. The scrapyard stood silent now, steam rising from the wet ground, the smell of iron and rain heavy in the air. The iron. Saints looked at each other, tired but alive. The engines behind them idled softly, a chorus of steady heartbeats waiting for what came next. Jack's eyes lingered on Eli, the boy who had become a mirror of everything he'd lost and everything he still hoped to save. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the exhaustion and pain, a new understanding took root, a revelation about loyalty, courage, and the choices that define a man long after the battle ends. And though the rain had stopped, the air still carried the weight of thunder, the kind that doesn't fade, just waits for the next strike. Dawn arrived the way forgiveness sometimes does, slow color seeping into the edges before anyone dares to believe it. The scrapyard no longer sounded like a machine chewing through steel. It breathed, almost human, steam lifting off wet piles of metal as if the place were exhaling for the first time in years. The rain had rinsed the dirt into dark ribbons, pooled in tire tracks, and settled into silence that felt earned. Engines idled soft as heartbeats, while the iron saints spaced out like sentries along the fence, watchful but calm. The floodlights clicked off one by one. In that hush, Eli stood a few paces from Jack, trembling in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The kid looked like a contradiction, jaw set with defiance, eyes shining with something too raw to name. He had grown into his bones and still carried the thinness of hunger. He didn't step forward, not yet. He just stared at the man who had once promised the world and disappeared into the rain. Jack took in the sight of him, taller, older, shoulders knotted with work, like a man trying to memorize the hidden truth of a life he'd missed. He wiped rain from his brow with the back of his hand and finally closed the distance, boots sinking in the mud. When he stopped, close enough to feel the kid's breath fog between them, he reached inside his jacket. The old patch came out carefully, the way you lift something. Sacred. It was softened by time, edges worn, colors ghosted, but the words still carried weight. Ride true. Jack went to one knee without drama, like the decision had been made long before he moved. "Took me a long time to find the road back, kid, but I'm here now." Eli's lower lip shook. For a heartbeat, he looked 10 again. "You said you would come back?" The words were not accusations so much as inventory, counting losses against one single return. Jack steadied his voice. "I did. And then I didn't. That's on me." He set the patch in his open palm, offering it like a promise rewound to the start. "This isn't a trophy. It's a direction. You don't have to take it. I just needed you to know it was always yours." Behind them, the brothers kept their distance, turning away the way men do when they understand a behind-the-scenes moment isn't theirs to witness. Mac busied himself checking a chain that didn't need checking. Reyes leaned against a fender, eyes closed, as if listening to something only he could hear. Hawk watched the eastern sky with that old, restless posture, pretending not to look back every few seconds. The mindset had shifted among them, less about victory, more about the impact of a promise finally kept. Eli glanced at the patch, then at Jack. "I kept it safe," he said, voice small and fierce at once. "Every time I thought about giving up, I held it and tried to remember what those words meant." Jack winced at the revelation because it cut both ways. A symbol meant to strengthen had also become proof of absence. "I'm sorry you had to carry it alone," Jack said quietly. "I thought walking away would save you from the fire. Hidden truth is, I was the one afraid of burning." Eli's eyes moved over Jack's face, as if measuring the years. "You look different," he said. "I guess I do too." Jack nodded. "You look like a man who learned to stand up, even when nobody's watching." The compliment didn't land as flattery. It landed as recognition. Eli's shoulders loosened half an inch. He reached out, not for Jack's hand, but for the patch. When his fingers closed around the fabric, a line of tension seemed to slacken across the yard. He held it to his chest, the way people hold a photograph right before the tears come. "It hurt," he admitted, voice cracking. "It hurt for a long time." "I know," Jack said, "and I can't give those years back, but I can stand with you now, every day, every decision. No more running." He stood, and for a moment, they simply breathed, steadying to the same rhythm. The light climbed the horizon, warming the wet metal into a soft copper haze. Somewhere a bird tried out a morning note above the groan of cooling engines, and it felt like a small permission to hope. Vince's men, those who hadn't fled, stayed clustered in the shadows near the office. No one dared speak. The night had peeled the bluster off them, leaving only faces, the kind that always look younger after a storm. Jack didn't gloat, and didn't look their way. This was not triumph, it was transformation. And transformation doesn't shout. It changes the air and lets everyone else notice. Mac finally broke the spell with a rough, almost cheerful practicality. "Boy's gonna freeze," he muttered, shrugging off a dry flannel from his saddlebag and tossing it toward Eli. Eli caught it, surprised, and Mac lifted his chin like that was the whole conversation. Reyes motioned toward a battered thermos. "Coffee's not good," he said, friendly but matter-of-fact. "But it's warm." Hawk scoffed and kicked a puddle. "Coffee's a miracle compared to what I've been drinking." The easy banter felt like sunlight after weeks of cloud, and yet nobody pushed the moment. The space between Jack and Eli remained protected, the center of gravity. Eli looked down at the patch again. "What does it even mean now?" he asked. The question was honest, not rhetorical. Jack answered without pretending to be wise. "It means we choose the road instead of the hole. It means when the world leans toward cruelty, we lean the other way. It means we don't leave people behind, and when we fail, we come back." He let the words sit. "It means you decide every day how you ride." "I learned a lot here," Eli said, glancing toward the bunkhouse, the office, the fence line where he'd once counted stars he couldn't see. "Learned decisions have prices. Learned silence can be a weapon. Learned I hate becoming what I survive." He looked up. "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I don't want to be a man who never tries." Jack's answer was a slow nod. "Trying's enough for today." A breeze slipped across the yard and turned the rising steam into brief veils. The landscape looked different minute by minute. Scrap piles softening in the morning light, puddles reflecting strips of orange sky, the dents and scars of the place suddenly readable like a map of what had happened here and what could be different after. That's the part of redemption people rarely talk about, the maintenance, the daily unglamorous work of living out a decision after the adrenaline fades. Reyes drifted closer, eyes kind. "There's a spare room behind the chapel, Jack. Kid can sleep there. Get some distance while we sort out papers and talk to whoever needs talking to." Jack looked at Eli for permission. The boy shrugged, but it was not indifference. It was consent without ceremony. "I'm not running anymore," Eli said, and the sentence hung with adult weight. Hawk clapped, once too loud, then hid the softness in his face by turning it into a smirk. "Good. Running's bad on the knees." Vince appeared at the doorway of his office with a split lip and a stare that tried to be hard, tried to pretend the night hadn't shifted the ground beneath him. Two deputies had finally scraped together the courage to roll up, the kind who arrive after the thunder to count the lightning strikes. They spoke briefly with Reyes and Mac, asking careful questions, the kind that want the biggest problem to be the paperwork. It wouldn't be clean. There would be statements, maybe charges, threads of the old rot that needed pulling. But the story had already moved somewhere their forms couldn't capture. The impact had been made in other coordinates. A hand opening to offer a patch, a boy deciding not to hate, a crew understanding that this ride wasn't about what they could break, but what they could build. Eli slipped the patch into his jacket pocket like a heartbeat and walked the perimeter of the yard, slow and deliberate, touching the fence, the stacked doors, the dead forklifts, as if taking inventory of what had shaped him. Jack followed at a respectful distance. "You're not talking me into leaving everything and riding off today," Eli said over his shoulder, a careful mixture of warning and invitation. "I've got things to settle." Jack didn't flinch. "Wasn't going to ask you to. We'll do this right. Behind the scenes, not loud. We talk to the folks you worked with, to the deputy who'll actually listen, to the judge who's tired of seeing the same cycle. We put truth on record, and we move forward one decision at a time." Eli stopped near the crusher and stared at it the way a person stares at a closed door they used to dream beyond. "He made me run that thing," he said. "Made me stand so close I could feel the heat in my teeth." Jack felt the flare of anger, the old, hot kind, and let it move through him without owning him. Transformation means your anger. Serves your purpose, not the other way around. "That won't be your story anymore," he said softly. "You get to edit now." They walked back toward the cluster of bikes where the others waited. The sky had shed its grey, revealing blue in ragged strips. One of the deputies, a woman with a lined face and steady eyes, nodded once to Eli as he passed, a signal that didn't pretend to be salvation, only respect. Respect is a revelation in places that run on fear. Mac handed Eli a helmet that had seen better decades. "Not fancy," he muttered, "but it's honest." Eli took it, weight testing in his hands, a symbol trying on its new meaning. Jack looked around the yard with a craftsman's eye, assessing damage the way a mechanic reads an engine by sound. "This place can be unmade," he said, "piece by piece." Eli's mouth twitched. "Then we start with the sign." He pointed at the rusted sheet metal where Vince and Sons still clung, despite never having had sons that anyone could name. Hawk grinned. "Now that's a quality project." Reyes smiled faintly. "First tear down of the morning is pride." They didn't rip it down just then. They didn't need performance, they needed sequence. The brothers turned to practicalities: fuel, food, a safe bed, documents to retrieve, names to write. It became a behind-the-scenes choreography of men who'd learned the hard way that big gestures matter less than consistent choices. There would be a long tail to this night. Hearings, statements, the slow unspooling of a man's influence in a town that had bent to him out of habit. But habit is not destiny. It just looks like it from far away. Eli stood beside Jack and stared at the row of bikes, their tanks catching sunlight like small shields. He cleared his throat. "I don't know if I want that life," he said, nodding at the chrome and the leather at the image of it all. "The road, the club," Jack answered with a small shake of his head. "I'm not asking you to be me. I'm asking you to be free. Your journey might be school, might be a shop, might be the road in summer and a bench in winter where you help kids not make the mistakes we did. Ride true doesn't always mean motorcycles." Eli looked down, then up. "What if I mess it up?" Jack's reply held no sermon, only a steadying truth. "Then you decide again. That's the work. Not perfection, direction." The words landed in the soft part of the morning where decisions feel possible. Eli slipped the helmet under his arm. "Okay," he said. "Direction." Across the yard, Vince's office door creaked shut. The deputies spoke into radios, voices low, the kind of logistics that birth consequences. The Iron Saints mounted up not to leave, but to reposition. Some to escort Eli to the chapel, some to roll through town and be seen not as threat, but as boundary, a quiet line drawn against the return of old patterns. Mac shot Jack a look that carried 20 years. "You good?" Jack let out a breath that tasted like rain and rust and relief. "Good enough to start." He turned back to Eli and reached out a hand, not the grip of rescue but the clasp of equals about to figure out the next right thing. Eli took it. "I used to think power was loud," the kid said, voice steadier than his hands. "Turns out it sounds like men who show up." Jack smiled, the curtain between who he'd been and who he'd become thinning in a way that felt like mercy. That's the revelation. Engines rose to a low chorus, a gentle one this time, as if the machines themselves understood they were carrying something fragile. The sun climbed fully over the ridge, transforming puddles into mirrors where sky and scrap shared the same frame. In those reflections, the town looked less like a lost cause and more like a sketch with room for revisions. The promise wasn't a single moment in the rain anymore. It was a practice, daily, stubborn, and unglamorous. Loyalty fulfilled not by fists or noise, but by presence repeated until it becomes normal. Jack swung a leg over his bike and kept both boots planted for a beat longer than necessary, feeling the steadiness settle into him. Eli stepped beside him, not on the back seat, not yet, but close enough for the road to feel shared. Reyes lifted 2 fingers in a small blessing. Hawk rolled his shoulders like a boxer after the bell. Mac tapped the gas twice, 2 soft notes that said, "Ready." It wasn't an ending, it was the next decision, lined up with the ones to follow. "Where do we start?" Eli asked, and the question didn't tremble this time. Jack pointed toward the chapel in the distance, then to the diner, then to the town hall whose doors had stuck so long they forgot how to open easily. "We start with names and with breakfast," he said. "We start by letting morning do what morning does." Eli nodded, breathing deeper. "Then let's go." They rolled forward at walking speed, tires whispering over damp gravel, leaving the gate open behind them like a statement. The yard watched them. Leave the way, a body watches a soul return. And as the town woke under the new light, porch doors opening, coffee poured, rumors already shifting into testimonies, the sound of the bikes threaded the streets with a different meaning than the night before. Not threat, not spectacle, a living vow moving from scene to scene. Redemption hadn't arrived with a shout. It had arrived with choices that held, with a patch passed from one palm to another, with a boy and a man agreeing to keep company with the future. The road ahead would complicate, as roads do, old loyalties swaying, small hatreds flaring, legalities grinding like gears that prefer the familiar. But the center had changed, and when centers change, everything else takes the hint. The sun lifted higher, striking the chapel's small cross and throwing a thin line of gold across the blacktop, like a path someone could actually follow. Jack looked at it, then at Eli, and felt the quiet click of a lock turning from the inside. He didn't say this was over. He didn't pretend the journey would be smooth. He simply let the engine idle, matching the kid's breath, and guided the bike onto the street that would lead them through the first of many doors waiting to open. The morning stretched wide and endless, that peculiar kind of quiet that follows a storm, the kind where everything seems to pause and remember what still matters. The sky above the small town was clear now, rinsed clean of its rage, and the light poured over the asphalt in ribbons of gold. Jack and Eli rode side by side down the long road leading out of the scrapyard, their engines humming like a heartbeat shared between 2 generations. The others followed in formation, the Iron Saints reborn, not as outlaws or legends, but as men who had learned that redemption isn't about what you destroy, it's about what you choose to rebuild. The wind cut sharp and cold against their faces, but it carried something softer underneath, a sense of release, of quiet revelation. For the first time in years, Jack didn't feel like he was running from ghosts. The guilt that once clung to him had thinned, not gone, but transformed into something different. Responsibility, presence. It's strange how redemption can start as punishment and end as peace. He looked to his left, to the boy who wasn't a boy anymore, and saw that Eli wasn't riding with fear or anger in his eyes. He was focused, steady, the kind of look a man wears when he finally decides who he wants to become. The town unfolded behind them like an old photograph left in the sun, faded but still breathing. People had come out to their porches to watch. Some waved, cautious but curious. Others just stared, unsure what they were witnessing. Maybe they saw it for what it was, a quiet change, a small miracle disguised as men on motorcycles. Every story has an aftertaste, something that lingers long after the noise fades. This one tasted like iron and dust, and something close to hope. As the road stretched further, Mac pulled up alongside Jack, his grin half hidden by the shadow of his helmet. "You realize," he shouted over the wind, "we might have just made history." Jack smirked. "History doesn't care about us, Mac, but maybe the kid will." Mac laughed and fell back into line. Behind them, Hawk let out a low whistle, that rare kind of whistle that meant he was impressed, but too proud to admit it. Reyes kept to the rear, steady as a prayer, the kind of anchor that reminded everyone why they still rode together. They passed the old diner where Jack once stopped years ago on a night when he thought he'd never come back. The sign still flickered, the coffee still bad, but the memory felt different now. Less about failure, more about perspective. It's the hidden truth of journeys like these. Sometimes you don't realize how far you've come until you ride back past the ghosts of your own footprints. The highway opened up, long and empty, stretching toward the horizon like a promise with no end. Jack felt the familiar vibration of the engine beneath him, the same rhythm that once sounded like escape, now sounding like renewal. There's something deeply human about that contradiction. The same roads that once carried you away can also lead you home if you've got the courage to turn around. He thought about all the roads he'd taken, the ones that led to bars and back rooms, to mistakes that carved scars he'd stopped trying to hide. Every detour, every breakdown, every mile spent alone. In silence, they had all built the man he was now. Transformation isn't clean, it's slow and uneven, and often hurts like hell. But that's what makes it real. It's not a moment, it's a mindset. A decision you make every day to keep riding, even when the road is rough and the past won't let go easily. Eli's voice cut through the wind, hesitant but clear. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" Jack didn't answer right away. He let the hum of the road fill the space before he spoke. "Every day," he said finally. "But I've stopped trying to predict it. Life's not about controlling the ride, kid. It's about learning when to let go of the handlebars and trust the wind to know the way." Eli nodded, eyes forward, expression unreadable. Then softer. "You think promises ever really die?" Jack looked at him, the question landing somewhere deeper than words. "Some do," he said. "The kind you make just to feel strong. But the real ones, the ones you make when your voice shakes, when you mean it. Even though you're scared, they don't die, they just wait." The sun climbed higher, painting everything in warm tones that made even the rough edges beautiful. Behind them, the brothers rode in a loose formation, the rumble of their engines sinking into one long, steady rhythm. It wasn't loud anymore, it was almost melodic, like the sound of memory settling into peace. Every man carried his own version of the night before, his own private reflection. For some, it was the taste of regret. For others, a strange new kind of faith. But for all of them, it was proof that it's never too late to become the man you were supposed to be. Jack's mind drifted to Cole, the brother they'd lost all those years ago, the one whose death had fractured everything. He imagined him riding just ahead of them, the ghostly hum of his engine barely audible over the living ones. "You see that?" Mac called out, pointing to the horizon where the sun met the asphalt. "Almost looks like he's still with us." Jack smiled faintly. He never left. Some truths don't need to be said loud to be understood. They stopped a few miles out at an overlook where the desert stretched in every direction, endless and golden under the morning light. The air was dry again, heavy with the smell of dust and fuel. Jack shut off his engine and let the silence settle. The wind whispered across the rocks like an old friend. "Funny," Hawk said after a while, breaking the quiet. "All those years I spent chasing noise, and now the silence feels better." Reyes chuckled, shaking his head. "That's not silence, brother. That's peace wearing a new jacket." Jack walked a few steps to the edge, looking down at the long road they'd traveled. "You ever think the road remembers us?" he asked, half to himself. Reyes joined him. "Maybe not our names," he said, "but the sound we make when we ride, that stays. It's how the world keeps track of who we were." Jack smiled, turning the thought over in his mind. Maybe that was the truth of it. Maybe promises like people don't really die. They just change form, carried forward through the echoes of those who still believe. The group lingered for a while, no one in a hurry to move. The horizon shimmered, endless and uncertain. But this time, uncertainty didn't feel like fear. It felt like freedom. Jack looked back at Eli, who stood with his helmet under his arm, watching the sunlight break across the sky. "You ready?" Jack asked. Eli nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "but not to run, to start." That simple line hit Jack harder than he expected. "Then we start," he said, his voice low, steady. He turned the key again, and the engine responded with that familiar, steady growl. The others followed one by one, the sound rising like a tide. They rode out again, not fast, not chasing anything, just keeping pace with the morning. The road curved, and the town faded behind them. Ahead lay open country, unknown miles, new decisions, the quiet work of rebuilding what had been broken. Jack didn't need to know where it led. Some journeys don't need a destination. They just need motion, intention, the steady rhythm of an engine that refuses to stop. As the landscape widened, Jack's thoughts softened into something close to prayer. Not the kind you whisper to a god, but the kind you say to yourself when you finally understand that redemption isn't a finish line, it's a way of traveling. He thought about all the people who'd crossed his path, the ones he hurt, the ones who forgave him, and the ones who never would. Every one of them had shaped him, carved him into the kind of man who could finally look forward without flinching at what was behind. The wind picked up again, brushing against his face, carrying the faint scent of rain somewhere far off. He could feel the others behind him, their presence steady, their trust unspoken. Together, they moved like one organism, flawed, scarred, but alive. The sound of their engines rolled through the desert, echoing off. Distant cliffs. The kind of sound that doesn't just fade, it lingers, it marks, it tells anyone listening that something here has changed. Some promises die when the engines stop, but some keep riding, through every brother who remembers why they swore it. The horizons swallowed their silhouettes one by one, the road stretching out before them like an unfinished story waiting to be written. The roar softened with distance until it became something else entirely, a heartbeat fading into the dawn. Steady, certain, and infinite. And if you made it this far, maybe this story spoke to something you felt too, that quiet pull between guilt and grace, between the person you were and the one you're still becoming. Stories like this remind us that no matter how far we go, there's always a road back, and sometimes it starts with a single decision to keep moving forward. If this one resonated with you, tell me in the comments. Just write, "I'm with you until the end." It's our way of knowing who rode through this story with us, who felt every mile of it. And if you want to keep walking this path with me, stories about redemption, second chances, and the kind of strength that doesn't shout but heals, hit subscribe. That's how we keep this journey alive. How these stories find more people who might need them. You can also tap the like button. It's a small gesture, but it lets me know this road matters to you as much as it does to me. And before you go, there's a video right here that continues this road of redemption. Click and keep riding with me there. The story doesn't end here. It just changes direction.